Hello everyone, this is Professor Hosselman, and these are the online lectures for History 104 Western Civilization until 1650, taught at Modesto Junior College. And in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at 5 different sub-lectures on events that coincide with the first chapter in your textbook. And these events that we're going to talk about, or these issues we're going to talk about, are what it means to be Western, a civilization, and the term foundations. We're going to talk about the beginnings of civilization in ancient Sumer, which we call Sumeria. We're going to talk about Egypt, the rise of the Hebrews, and a succession of other empires that arise before we get into ancient Greece, which will be the next set of lectures. In this lecture, we're going to break it up into those 5 pieces, and we'll go ahead and we'll go through all those 5 pieces. But before we go, a little bit of background about what we'll be doing in this course. So in this course, we're going to explore the essential contours of the human experience and what has been called Western civilization, from its humble beginnings in the ancient Near East to the dawn of the modern world. And will range from about 3000 BCE up until about 1600, 1650, and we'll begin by asking just what Western civilization actually is, or what it has been thought to be. Now, throughout the course, we'll pause to reflect on where Western Civ finds its primary locus at any given moment. That is, we'll begin in the ancient Near East and move to Greece, then to Rome. We'll explore the shape and impact of large ancient empires, including the Persian, Alexander the Great's, and Rome's. And when we take our leave of Rome, we'll move to Western Europe, and we'll watch Europe gradually expand physically and culturally. And finally, we'll see the globalizations of Western civilization with the Portuguese and Spanish voyages of exploration and discovery. But Western Civ is much more than human and political geography. We will also explore the myriad forms of political, institutional structures by means of which Western peoples have organized themselves and their societies. These include monarchies of several distinct types, as well as participatory republics. Now, looking at institutions will draw us to inquire about the Western tradition of political discourse. Who should participate in any given society? Why? How have societies resolved the tension between individual self-interest and the common good, as well as lots of other questions. Now, Western Civ is also accorded a prominent place to religion, and by extension, to religious institutions and leaders. And we will ask why this should be the case. Now, although we will pay some attention to the ancient religions of the Mediterranean world, we'll focus throughout on 3 dominant monotheistic traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, each of these religious traditions produced sacred books and vast commentaries on those books. Christianity also produced art, architecture, and music that have become living parts of the Western tradition. Now, if Western culture was at its source primarily religious, it was never exclusively so. Now, this insight will invite us to probe the philosophical tradition of the West, as it has asked how people should live, how they should conduct themselves, and what they should regard as beautiful, and where they should find their pleasure. We will notice that the West has provided many answers to these fundamental questions. What has been common are the rational tools of debate used to seek answers, and the ferocious critical tools elaborated to cross-examine every answer that has been offered. Now, Western civilization finally has bequeathed to us a library full of literary monuments, and we'll discuss these from the standpoints of their technical artistry, their aesthetic adornment, their political and social messages, their real and imagined audiences, and their long-term impact. And we'll ask why we continue to read some works and have forgotten others. Now, with literature, indeed, as with other objects of our investigations, we'll continually ask ourselves what is more, or we'll continually ask what is more and than what was. And we will seek to understand why some things remain living elements of a civilization. Okay, so let's begin. So as I mentioned earlier, most of this stuff is going to be related also in your first chapter of your Making of the West textbook. So make sure you read that either before or after you listen to today's lecture. Now, for Sherlock Holmes, the first principle of detection was to begin with the obvious. So let's turn the old sleuth on his head and begin with what is not so obvious. Now, what do we mean when we speak of the West? Now, we can define this term culturally. Free and participatory political institutions, capitalist economies, religious toleration, rational inquiry, an innovative spirit, and so on. And we can define the term geographically. The cultural tradition that began around the Mediterranean Sea, spent centuries as a European preserve, then migrated to all the earth. Now, any definition brings controversy. The West has had freedom and slavery. Women have historically enjoyed fewer rights and opportunities than men. Some have enjoyed vast wealth, while others endured deep poverty. Definitions also bring paradox. Western civilization began in what is now Iraq. But it would be hard to make a case now for Iraq as Western. Today, Japan in the Far East seems Western, and in the Cold War years, Turkey was Western while Libya, far to the west of Turkey, was Eastern. So lots of confusions with the term. Now, civilization is no easier to define. The word itself is built from a Latin root, civ, C-I-V, and we see this in such words, Latin words as civis, or for the citizen, civitas, for the city, or civilis, for civil, polite, or citizen-like. Thus, cities appear crucial to our sense of what civilization is. The Greek vocabulary is similarly revealing. Polis, for the Greek word for city, gives us our words for politics and political. Cities emerged as a result of what is called the Neolithic Revolution, which occurred about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now, essentially, this process involved the rise of agriculture and the domestication of animals. And the process was revolutionary, but it took a long time to produce cities and then a civilization. Extracting food from arid regions surrounding great rivers demanded social cohesion and cooperation. Irrigation was a key motor process. Concentrated populations grew as more people could be fed more predictably. Now, this led to the specialization of labor, which in turn resulted in social and political differentiation. Gradually, arts and crafts emerged, and finally, writing. Now, with writing, we cross into the historical period. Now, these key elements seem to mark all civilizations, but one may also speak of Western civilization, or African civilization, or somewhat more narrowly of Maya or Aztec civilization. The West is unique, but it is not uniquely civilized. Civilization arose about 5,000 years ago, and that's a long time. But the Earth is about 4 billion years old. People like us, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been around for some 40,000 years, and their ancestors for about 100,000 years. Human ancestors go back to Africa 1 million or so years ago, and these time spans are rather humbling. Finally, then, what do we mean by foundation? So we talked about what Western means, civilization, and now we're going to talk about this term foundations. Now, we mean origins, of course, but not just origins because all things grow and change. Durability is important, but paradoxical. The oldest institution in the world today is the papacy, but Catholics are just under 20% of the world's population. The Athenian polis lasted in its highest manifestations less than a century, but its ideals have fired imaginations for 2,500 years. Few places today live by Roman law, yet Rome's law was the most influential ever conceived. Foundations seem somehow related to revivals. Think of Greek or classical revival architecture. Think of one of the West's great monuments, the Renaissance, or movements, the Renaissance, allegedly a revival of classical antiquity. The Protestant reformers thought that they were reviving primitive Christianity, not creating something new. Foundations seem to be related to traditions, but these can be both invented and discarded. Those famous and ancient Scottish tartans were mostly invented in the 18th century. That is, the Scottish skirts, or the skirts that you see them wear. I passed a restaurant the other day with a sign that read, "A tradition since 1979. Now, what does that mean? Now, in the following lectures, we'll proceed through some 4,500 years, and we'll begin in the ancient Near East and end with a Western European world beginning to globalize. Now, what themes will we follow? Without being clumsy determinists, we'll talk of ecology, geography, and climate. Both the visible structures and invisible ideologies supporting them will draw continuous and comparative attention. Now, although pagan religions or religious beliefs and practices will emerge or engage us from time to time, we shall concentrate on three Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we'll ask how people lived, how they earned their livings, and what their manners and customs were like, how their families were organized, and how they spent whatever leisure time they had. And we'll explore key philosophical ideas, always with a view to understanding them in specific historical contexts. Why did these people think those things in those times? And this is very important. We're not going to be thinking how we think today. That must have been how they thought then. People thought differently throughout time. We'll also discuss great works of literature, the ideas they expressed, and the forms in which they were presented. We'll look into their backgrounds, their intended audiences, and their actual audiences right down to today. And we'll talk about art and architecture as the most public and visible manifestations of the Western tradition. But alongside these concrete ideas, we'll repeatedly tease out perspectives on celebrity versus distinction, values versus virtues, changing understandings of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the respective roles of faith and reason, and the competing claims of the individual and the community. We'll end around AD 1600, 1650, when many of the major features of modernity have come into view, and the essential traditions of Western civilization have attained maturity. Two great backward-looking movements, the Renaissance and the Reformation, anchored tradition firmly into the Western worldview. Christendom was durably divided into Catholic and Protestant communities and cultures. Interlocking relationships of great power, diplomacy, foreshadowed the modern state system, and the scientific revolution altered the old balance of science and wisdom. So now let's go back in time and talk about the beginning of Western civilization. Now, although Mesopotamia is all the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, the earliest traces of civilization appeared in Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, and possibly at Tel Hamarkur, in what is now southeastern Syria. Now, the Uruk period, from about 3800 to 3200 BCE, was tremendously creative, with the invention of the wheel and plow, the planting of the first orchards of dates, figs, and olives, and the development of metal casting. Perhaps most significant was writing, as what we call cuneiform. People built cities with walls, circuits up to 5 miles, and buildings of mud brick. The most impressive early buildings were temples, known as ziggurats, and temple priesthoods dominated society. In the dynastic period, from about 2800 to 2350 BCE, fierce competition between cities and perhaps inside them too led to the emergence of local strongmen, known as lugals, who evolved into kings. Kings claimed to be the representatives of the gods and to rule by the favor of the gods, and this process introduced theocratic kingship. As warfare became more important, large landowners formed a military aristocracy. Mesopotamia is a broad, open plain surrounded by deserts and, beyond the deserts, by mountains. The region has no natural frontiers to ward off migrants or conquerors, and areas beyond Mesopotamia were inhabited by people of lower cultural development who coveted the comparative riches and security of Mesopotamia. After about 2350 BC, Sumer was several times overran by outsiders. Now, Sargon, from 2371 to 2316, conquered Sumer, this region we were talking about earlier, from Akkad to the north, then expanded his holdings, as did his son after him, to the east and west. This first imperial state demanded little of its subjects and, ironically, was itself conquered by Sumerian culture. After Akkadian rule eventually weakened, there was a period of relative independence for Sumerian cities, followed by Babylonian conquest. Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750, was the most famous and powerful of the Babylonians, or Amorites. His law code was influential for centuries, and like the Akkadians before them, the Babylonians adopted and spread Sumerian culture. Now, in religion, people were polytheists and syncretists. Sky gods were generally thought of as male, related to power. Earth gods were thought of as female and related to fertility. Individual forces of nature were also invested with divine power. Animism is a habit of mind that sees nothing as wholly lifeless. Gods and goddesses differed from humans in supernatural powers and immortality. They were capricious. Religion sought to propitiate them. Religion was pessimistic and fatalistic, and it had no ethical dimension at all. This outlook was perhaps related to the geography and politics of the region. Religion served as an impressive attempt to begin to systematize knowledge about the natural world. Law was issued by councils of notables in conjunction with priests and kings. Law was not abstract and philosophical as it is today. Publishing laws in public places established the important principles that all are subject to the law. The law belongs to all, and that law rules, not men. In literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh was a remarkable achievement. The epic is a Sumerian work dating to around 2500 BCE that survives in later versions dating to around 800 BCE, a tribute to its dissemination. An epic is a work on a grand scale dealing with gods and heroes. It is serious in tone, elevated in language, and universalizing in outlook. Gilgamesh is a tale of the adventures and friendship of King Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu. It contains a mythical account of the civilizing process and a poignant reflection on mortality as the irreducible element in the human condition. There are other works too, for example, short poems by Enkiduana, Sargon's daughter, and the world's first known woman writer. Now, sciences probably derived from watching the heavens, measuring fields and regulating irrigation hydraulics. Sumerians developed the decimal and sexagesimal system. Hence, we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and so on. Sumerians understood place values in numbers, that is, the difference between 35 and 53, and they anticipated Greek developments in mathematics. Now, Sumerian culture gradually spread over much of Western Asia and directly or indirectly influenced all the people who emerged within or who conquered those lands, including the later empire-building Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Turks. Now, specific Sumerian practice and beliefs were adopted and adapted for millennia. So let's now move west of Sumer, and let's talk now about Egypt, the gift of the Nile. Now, the Greek writer Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and so it was. The Nile is a long, powerful river running in a northerly direction some 750 miles away from the last cataract to the Mediterranean. It floods annually and predictably, an area 5 to 15 miles wide. About 5% of Egypt is habitable. Without the Nile, there'd be only barren desert, and from as early as 5000 BCE, small communities along the Nile began to drain marshes, irrigate, and plant regular crops, mainly cereal grains. Now, slowly, these communities coalesced into nomes. It's a Greek word. We do not know what the word the Egyptians used, under what we call nomarchs. Now, then the nomes of the south, Upper Egypt, became, or because it's near to the source of the Nile, and the north, Lower Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile, formed as larger entities. Now, it seems that a need to control irrigation led to political organization on a larger scale. Much about this period is shrouded in legend, but about 3100 BCE, Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt, and this unification ushered in the historical period. Now, historians divide Egypt's historical period into 30-some dynasties or families of rulers. The dynasties are grouped into the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, with intermediate periods in between. The Old Kingdom, from about 2695 to 2160 BCE, was an era of great vitality, security, and prosperity. Egypt was isolated and untroubled by invaders. Now, a distinctive Egyptian kingship evolved. The word pharaoh comes from Purah, meaning the great house. Pharaoh was one of the gods and guaranteed Egypt's prosperity and security. In turn, Egypt's prosperity and security legitimized the pharaoh. The great pyramids of Giza symbolized the Old Kingdom. So in other words, if the pharaoh was strong, the kingdom was strong. And if the kingdom was strong, the pharaoh remained strong. But any time things started to go bad, there were these shakeups in society. The Middle Kingdom, that ran from about 2025 to 1786 BCE, was a period of more widely dispersed rule. Pharaohs shared power with local notables. This period was important in the elaboration of Egyptian religion because the emphasis moved beyond the royal dynasty to nobles and even ordinary people. Around 1700 BCE, the Hyksos, or Semitic-speaking peoples from Palestine, conquered Egypt. Hatred for foreign rule eventually led to a dynasty from Upper Egypt to drive out the Hyksos and inaugurate the New Kingdom, which ran from about 1550 to 1075 BCE. Fired by ambition and a desire to ward off future conquests, the Egyptians now built an empire that extended into Mesopotamia and along the shore of the eastern Mediterranean. This was a brilliant and cosmopolitan period. After about 1400 BC, the Egyptians confronted the Hittites, a powerful and expanding people from Anatolia, and the first Indo-European speakers in recorded history. In 1274, at Kadesh in northern Syria, the Egyptians and Hittites fought a battle that left them both crippled and declining. Now, everything starts with the pharaoh in a two-class society, the pharaoh and everybody else. Egypt first displayed an abstract sense of rule, the separation of ruler and office, and the complete removal of the ruler from the ordinary realm of humans. Religion grew more complicated over time. The peace and prosperity of the Old Kingdom led to a happy, optimistic outlook. The concept of the afterlife, as a continuation of this life, not something better, was reserved mainly to the pharaoh, his family, and perhaps a few key advisors. The Middle Kingdom saw a profusion of temples and new cults. Herodotus called the Egyptian the most religious of all people. This might have been a reemergence of pre-dynastic religion or a response to unsettled conditions at this time. The afterlife seemed to have been considered available to all. Now, the concept of ma'at became crucial. That is, the idea of truth, justice, balance, and order. The myth of Osiris revealing the Middle Kingdom was popular. The New Kingdom saw the remarkable religious experiment of Akhenaten. He abandoned traditional worship to promote the cult of Aten, henotheism or monolatry, but this died with him. Scientific and artisanal advances were striking. The use of papyrus facilitated writing and record-keeping. Hieroglyphic or pictographic writing gave way gradually to demotic, which was more efficient than cuneiform. And the desire to preserve bodies intact, or mummification, for the afterlife led to advances in medical science, including surgery and knowledge of anatomy. Greek and Romans were impressed, even dazzled by the Egyptians, as have been most visitors to Egypt since antiquity. Seeing just what influence Egypt actually had, however, is not so easy. Political control lasted a short time. Divinized kingship reoccurred, but not necessarily because of the Egyptians. No new literary forms were added. Monumental architecture as propaganda recurred, but this idea is not Egyptian. Early Egyptologists were eager to claim the ancient Egyptians for the West. After World War II, as colonial empires crumbled and black consciousness arose, some people claim that Egypt was an African civilization. Indeed, that Egypt was Africa, and vice versa. In its most extreme forms, this view has held that Western civilization was stolen from the Egyptians by the Greeks. Now, this view again puts a sharp focus on Egypt, but without solid reasons for doing so. Perhaps these historical mysteries explain the mysterious smile of the Sphinx. Now we're going to go east again. Now, after the Egyptians and Hittites exhausted themselves, and before other large, powerful states emerged, there was a brief period of importance for some small states and peoples. Sea peoples, most famously the Philistines, attacked along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean after about 1200 BCE. The Phoenicians managed to avoid conquest. They were Canaanites who spoke a Semitic language and who had been present in the region of what is today coastal Syria and Lebanon for centuries. After about 900, they created one of the first great commercial empires the world had seen, anticipating the Athenians, Venetians, and Dutch. Creating colonies all over the Mediterranean, including at Carthage and Massilia, the Phoenicians played a role in spreading Mesopotamian culture and in beginning the creation of a Mediterranean cultural network. By 600 BCE, they had almost certainly circumnavigated Africa, and by about 450, they had reached Britain. The other significant people who emerged in this big power pause were the Hebrews. Again, much of the Hebrews' history is shrouded in legend. A pastoralist, Abraham, who has been dated between 1200 and 1550 BCE, was the leader of a people who were on the outs with the settled city dwellers and grain farmers of Sumer. Abraham and his God made a pact, and Abraham was told to leave Ur for the land of Canaan or Palestine. For some centuries, Abraham's descendants farmed the land, quarreled among themselves, and tried to ward off enemies. Now eventually they were swept up in the struggles between the Egyptians and the Hittites. The familiar story says that the Hebrews were carried off in bondage to Egypt. Some probably were prisoners of war, but others doubtless migrated there voluntarily because the area was more peaceful and prosperous. Moses arose as a leader who forged a people during the Exodus, a long process of departing from Egypt and re-entering the promised land. Now, for a time, the Hebrews lived under numerous independent judges, but the threat of the sea peoples, chiefly the Philistines, induced them to choose Saul, or king, first Saul, then David, and then Solomon. Under Solomon, the kingdom reached its high point, and considerable commercial wealth flowed in. But a distaste for strong central authority led to a division of the kingdom into Israel in the north, with its capital at Samaria, and Judah in the south, with its capital at Jerusalem. Eventually, these small kingdoms were conquered by more powerful neighbors. Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722, and Judah to the Neo-Babylonians in 586. The Assyrians, in particular, physically dispersed the Hebrews all over the Near East, in what we call the exile. Now, never has a people been so politically insignificant, yet culturally so critical in the history of Western civilization. It is the religion of the Hebrews that has left so deep an imprint. Our knowledge of the beliefs of the Hebrews comes from a collection of writings, that in some ways cover the period from about 2000 to 200 BCE, but that were mostly written down after 1000 BCE. These writings are properly called the Hebrew Bible, or the Hebrew Scriptures. To Christians, these materials are the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible consists of three major kinds of materials. The first of the 5 books, known as the Torah, and sometimes called the Books of Moses. The name means the teaching, and these Hebrew books contain the prescriptions that govern the life of the Hebrews. The books known as the prophets contain both historical books such as Kings, Samuel, and Chronicles that reveal God's unfolding relationship with his people, and the more obviously prophetic books of the greater prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, and the lesser prophets such as Amos and Micah. Now, the catch-all designation for the poetic materials of the Hebrew Bible, known as the writings, included the Psalms and the Canticles, and for the beautiful and moving advice literature such as Proverbs and Wisdom. Now, aside from the book, 3 central religious ideas contained in the Hebrew Bible, taken together, constitute the key foundations of Western civilization. The first is the idea of the covenant, which was created between Yahweh and Abraham, between God and a tribe, and renewed between Yahweh and Moses, between God and a people. And it was redefined by the prophet Ezra during the exile, between God and the people adhering to the Torah. The unique notion of reciprocity appears here for the first time. The covenant also embodies the unique notion of a chosen people, one God for one people, not a God for a place or a state. The second idea that develops during this time period is what we call exclusive monotheism, and has a long evolution from henotheism, still present in the time of Moses, to monotheism in the time of Isaiah. Now, this occasioned a profound tension between the idea that Yahweh was the only God and the God of the Hebrews, and the possibility of universalism. The idea is seen most vividly in the book of Jonah. Now, the idea of ethical monotheism is the profound sense of social justice that runs through the prophetic books is unprecedented in the previous religion experience of known peoples. God demanded a particular kind of behavior as a guarantee of his continuing benevolence. This idea is seen in the Decalogue and Shema in Micah. So in other words, God will be good to you if you follow the rules and do what God asks. Philosophers and theologians have long acknowledged the importance of monotheism for everything from natural philosophy to political ideology. Numerous peoples in the West have called themselves a New Israel as a way of claiming a unique, chosen relationship with providence. Historically, social justice has sometimes been a secular concern, but much more often one with religious roots. Western literature is unimaginable without its fundamental formative text, the Bible. All right. To finish up this lecture, we're going to talk about a succession of empires that that kind of arise during this time period, and will bring us up to ancient Greece, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Now, the period of Phoenician and Hebrew independence ended with the rise of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were a Semitic Semitic-speaking people who had been important in northern Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BCE, then declined and re-emerged around Nineveh in about 900. They began a series of campaigns that carried them to Persia in the east and Egypt in the west. Their success was facilitated by a huge army, iron weapons, and cavalry. In 722, the Assyrians conquered Israel and deported its inhabitants, the 10 lost tribes. These policies were cruel. State terrorism was their normal practice. Even their art glorified fear and destruction. The Assyrians eventually evoked a challenge from a coalition of peoples who were seen as the liberators of those whom the Assyrians had conquered. One key group was the Neo-Babylonians. The dynasty of whom Nebuchadnezzar was the most famous built a large realm in Mesopotamia after the fall of the Assyrians. The main achievement of this dynasty was the massive rebuilding of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Minor players were the central Anatolian Lydians. The Lydians' main historical achievement was the invention of coinage around 700 BCE. The most famous king was Croesus, whose wealth, probably because he heaped up coins, was legendary. The greatest members of the anti-Assyrian coalition were the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were from the Zagros Mountains, and the Persians were from the Iranian plain. They were ethnically related and spoke similar languages. Until Persian Cyrus, who ruled from 559 to 530, assumed leadership, the Medes had generally been the dominant partner. Cyrus began a series of lightning campaigns that were continued by his successors, Cambyses and Darius. They built the largest empire in the world that the world had yet seen. There were several reasons for Persian success. The Persians had a huge army, up to 300,000 men, with an elite corps of 10,000 immortals. They practiced brilliant cavalry tactics and were the first to understand the significance of the cavalry. They were tolerant of the customs of local peoples and often left their own people in charge. They were highly skilled at administration. The Persians set up an elaborate administrative network under satraps, and they developed common systems of weights, measures, and coinage. The Persian imperial post, the Great Roads, including the Royal Road, and they also used the widely known Aramaic language instead of Persian. The chief manifestation of Persian culture was the religion Zoroastrianism. Scholars dispute the dates of Zarathustra. He may have lived around 1750 or 550 BC. His teachings are revealed by gathas, or songs, preserved in the Avesta, the holy scriptures of Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra thought of a single benevolent god, Ahura Mazda, who was the creator of all, but he also was intrigued by the problem of evil. Zarathustra taught that Ahura Mazda had twin children, one benevolent and one evil. These two played out a great cosmic challenge between good and bad, truth and falsehood, and so on. Human beings are endowed with free will to choose one path or the other. Zarathustra stressed superiority of the spiritual over the material. Now, this dualism would recur time and time again in the West, such as among the Manichaeans, Bogomils, and Cathars. The Assyrians and Babylonians left some impressive ruins, but not much else. The Persians left a legacy of civilized rule, ideas about kingship and government, and a profound religious heritage that interacted reciprocally with Judaism and Christianity. So this is the end of our first lecture, in which we talked about the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the rise of Egypt, the Phoenicians, the rise of the Hebrews as a small kingdom, and then ending with the Neo-Babylonians and the Persians, and what these different civilizations brought and incorporated, helped the West incorporate and to define itself. Now that we're finished with this lecture, you can look at that question to consider, and remember that after each series of lectures, there's a discussion thread that you need to complete in Canvas. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Remember to do the reading, and I look forward to working with you the rest of the semester. So once again, this is Professor Hasselman, History 104, Western Civilization until about 1650.